Hello, this is the Federal Government in Action, Section B, Work of the Federal Government lecture. Our prioritized standard is Government Civics 52. Objectively, we're going to examine the scope of the federal government. The President does not manage the federal government alone, as much of the work is done by the Presidential Administration, including the Executive Office of the President, or EOP for short, the executive departments, and several independent agencies. The Executive Office of the President, EOP, is made up of several influential agencies that perform key functions for the President. EOP is overseen by the White House Chief of Staff, which includes important officials like the press secretary, the president's counsel or legal advisor. EOP is home to many of the president's closest policy and political advisors, things like the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, Council of Environmental Equality, among many, many other entities. Much of the work of the federal government is done by the 15 executive departments, sometimes called cabinet departments, which include the departments of State, Treasury, Defense, Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and the newest Homeland Security. Each department is headed by a secretary, or in the case of the Department of Justice, an attorney general, which is appointed by the president. Generally speaking, a president usually gets the people that they nominate, with just very few exceptions. These secretaries make up what's known as the cabinet, which is an informal advisory body to the president that meets on a regular basis. The several independent agencies that are a part of the executive branch operate independent of presidential control, completing important duties for the federal government or serving in some type of regulatory capacity. So this includes many groups, some like the Fed, NASA, the EPA, FTC, the FDIC, the U.S. Postal Service, the SEC, FCC, among many others. The federal government has come to be expected to provide an ever-growing range of goods and services for its citizens since its inception. The federal government spends much of its money on just a few priorities. Social Security benefits, for instance, make up around 23.4% of federal spending. Should point out these are 2016 numbers, so the numbers could be different from year to year, but the proportions are pretty close. So that amounted to almost $1 trillion for just Social Security. The national defense makes up 15.1% of federal spending, which was close to $600 billion a year. Medicare benefits make up 14.9% of federal spending, which is also close to $600 billion a year. Medicaid benefits make up 9.3% of federal spending, which provides health care for low-income citizens, if you're unfamiliar with that program, which is over $350 billion. As the Constitution calls for the creation of a military, national defense has commonly been a major expense of the federal government. Wars tend to result in spikes in spending, as you can probably see from the dates on some of these, while peacetime results in declines in spending. While the national defense spending declined during the 1990s, as a for instance, so here we see a decline in the 1990s, it increased during the 2000s War on Terror, as you see the large increase. Another 6.1% of federal spending goes toward interest payments on the national debt. So that amounts to about $240 billion a year, just interest for the national debt. Not paying it off, just the interest on it. The federal government responds to the perceived social needs of society in several ways. One way of responding to perceived social needs is through the providing of public goods. Public goods are produced directly by the government instead of by private businesses. Production of public goods means that private businesses are not adequately providing these goods or services for the general public. Another way of responding is through the federal government's growing regulatory role. The government has worked to make markets more competitive by passing antitrust and consumer protection laws and creating agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. The government has worked to improve the environment, passing environmental laws, and also creating the agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, among others, but that just gives you a little bit of an example. A final way of responding is through defining and enforcing property rights for its citizens, which is achieved when the government uses its power to not only determine where one person's property ends and another begins, but also using its power to enforce these boundaries when conflicts arise. So, as hopefully you know, this power does go well beyond just land and buildings, also including things like intellectual property. The federal government aims to stabilize the economy by keeping unemployment and prices at appropriate levels and encouraging economic growth through fiscal and monetary policy. Both of these are terms you're going to hear more in econ, but we are going to mention them here. With fiscal policy, the federal government can stimulate or restrain the economy through taxation or spending policies. So decreasing taxes, meaning taking less money from people, and or increasing spending, meaning the government directly spends money for people, actually stimulates the economy, putting more money in people's hands. Increasing taxes, meaning taking money away from people, and or decreasing spending, meaning providing less things for the government, providing less things for people, this restrains the economy and therefore takes money out of the economy. An independent regulatory commission that's known as the Federal Reserve, which we'll talk more in depth about when we have econ, conducts monetary policy. We'll talk about how specifically that policy works when you're in econ. The federal government generates its revenue through various taxes and borrowing. Most federal revenue comes through taxes. Around 41% of that comes through individual income taxes, which amounts to over $1.6 trillion. Again, we're using 2016 numbers. 27.9% comes from payroll taxes, which pays for Social Security and Medicare taxes, possibly on your tax or on a pay stub. If you've ever seen FICA, that's what that is. This is over $1 trillion, $1.1 trillion to be more specific. 7.4% comes from corporate income taxes, or about just under $300 billion. That number probably will go down based on recent congressional actions. And 7.9% comes from other types of assorted taxes and other types of sources. The remaining 15.6% of federal revenue comes from the creation of new debt by borrowing money from individuals, corporations, financial institutions, or foreign governments through what are called federal securities. So this amounts to over $600 billion of our money comes from just borrowing it for someone else. This means that the federal government spends more money than it actually brings in. This has led to a growing national debt. So as you see, we've had some steep increases in the last several decades. This problem of a growing national debt can only be reversed by either decreasing government spending or raising taxes, or logically speaking, by doing both. All right, this concludes Federal Government in Action. Section B, Work of the Federal Government. Again, our prioritized standard was Government and Civics, Standard 52, and objectively now you can examine the scope of the federal government